Buried beneath the foundations of modern cities and locked deep inside restricted museum archives, there are physical artifacts that shatter the accepted timeline of human development. We find massive bronze faces cast without a single historical record and giant skeletal remains systematically boxed up and shipped away from the public eye. These physical relics provide hard evidence of a vastly different history than what mainstream experts teach. They represent a forgotten era that the accepted maps of human history actively refuse to acknowledge. Today, we are going on a journey to expose 7 of these hidden anomalies. Each one challenges exactly what we thought we knew about our ancestors. What makes this so fascinating is the extreme lengths institutions will go to keep them from the public eye. Are these just isolated mistakes or a deliberate effort to keep the true story of humanity a secret? So if that sounds interesting, then sit back, relax, grab a snack, and join us. And if you enjoy deep dive documentaries like this every single week, then make sure to subscribe. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Imagine an excavation site completely submerged beneath a shallow lake. In the Castoria region of northern Greece lies the prehistoric community of Dispilio. This was an artificial island built on wooden piles driven directly into the lake bed thousands of years ago. The people who lived here engineered a highly complex farming society long before the great monuments of Egypt were even a concept. Extracting artifacts from this kind of muddy environment is a massive logistical nightmare because ancient wood usually crumbles the moment it hits the open air. The lake itself acts as a natural time capsule, sealing away an entire forgotten chapter of European history. The water levels of Lake Castoria fluctuated over the centuries and occasionally exposed the old wooden posts of the settlement. Local residents knew about these submerged ruins since the 1930s, but scientific exploration did not begin until decades later. When a severe drought struck the region in 1992, the receding waterline revealed a massive concentration of ancient artifacts trapped in the sediment. Greek archaeologist George Hormouziadis quickly organized a team to map the settlement before the waters returned to cover the site. They were entirely unprepared for the sheer level of sophistication they were about to pull from the mud. During the 1993 excavation season, researchers uncovered an object that looked completely out of place in a primitive fishing village. They found a carved cedar tablet measuring roughly the size of a modern notebook hidden deep in the dark mud. The surface was covered in deliberate markings that were clearly not simple tally marks or random decorative patterns. These were specific linear symbols arranged in distinct rows that represented a highly developed system of communication. Finding complex text in a Neolithic dig site immediately changed the scope of the entire expedition. Wood usually rots away very quickly, but the oxygen-free environment of the lake bottom preserved this specific piece of cedar for millennia. To prevent the tablet from turning to dust upon exposure, the research team had to put it through a rigorous conservation process to stabilize the material. Once the physical integrity of the artifact was secure, scientists performed extensive radiocarbon dating to establish exactly when these symbols were carved. The results returned a definitive date of roughly 5,200 BC. This specific timeline creates a massive problem for the experts' maps because it completely shatters the accepted model of human development. The Dispilio community was not just a temporary camp, but a highly organized society capable of long-term environmental management. Excavators uncovered evidence of advanced animal herding, complex pottery firing techniques, and specialized tools made from bone and flint. They even found structural elements of their homes, including clay used to insulate wooden walls against the harsh lake winters. For reference, modern builders still use similar thermal mass techniques to regulate temperature in off-grid housing. The physical layout of the settlement heavily implies a society advanced enough to require exactly the kind of written script found on the cedar block. The symbols carved into the cedar do not resemble any known alphabet or early pictographic system. Researchers identified over 50 distinct character shapes cut into the wood, which suggests a complex grammatical structure rather than basic agricultural record-keeping. Our museatists argued that the text likely represented a localized attempt to record social or religious concepts, far exceeding the complexity of simple trade tallies. Without a bilingual translation key like the Rosetta Stone, modern linguists have no practical way to decipher what the Dispilio text actually says. The mainstream narrative dictates that the earliest form of writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3100 BC, with the Sumerian cuneiform. We are taught that complex written language was a byproduct of massive societies building the first true cities in the Middle East. The Dispilio Tablet predates the Sumerian script by over 2,000 years and originates from a relatively small European lake settlement. The math simply doesn't add up when experts try to force a fully formed writing system into a period when humans were supposedly just learning how to farm. When news of the tablet first circulated, the mainstream establishment immediately tried to cast doubt on its origins. Some experts argued that the artifact must have been dropped into the mud by a traveler thousands of years after the village was abandoned. However, the precise location of the tablet buried alongside period-accurate pottery completely invalidated this theory. The sediment layers of the lake bed were undisturbed and proved the cedar block belonged to the original inhabitants of the artificial island. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to ignore hard physical data, simply because it ruins the established timeline. Normally, a discovery of this magnitude would trigger massive funding and dominate archaeological journals overnight. Modern institutions usually rush to publish major artifacts to secure global recognition and university grants. Instead, the Dispilio Tablet was locked away in a university drawer and left completely unstudied for over a decade. Rather than celebrating a scientific breakthrough, the academic establishment treated the wooden artifact like a frustrating liability. They simply pushed it out of sight because it didn't fit their accepted map of human history. The tablet was essentially ignored by the broader historical community because it actively contradicted the established timeline of Mesopotamia. Western academia has spent over a century building a rigid framework that crowns the Middle East as the sole cradle of civilization. When physical evidence suggests other ancient cultures developed writing thousands of years earlier, it is met with extreme institutional pushback. Experts routinely dismiss these ancient scripts as random scratches or localized art, rather than dealing with the actual radiocarbon data. It is much easier for them to ignore hard physical evidence than to rewrite generations of history textbooks. Even today, the ongoing excavations at Lake Castoria suffer from a highly suspicious lack of funding and institutional attention. Major universities make very little effort to scour the remaining lakebed for more tablets or clues about this advanced culture. By cutting off resources to the site, the mainstream establishment effectively starves the discovery of the attention it deserves. If prestigious institutions are willing to hide physical evidence of early writing just to protect their academic pride, the scope of suppressed history is likely staggering. But if a simple wooden tablet can cause a decade of institutional silence, what happens when an entire technological civilization challenges the single origin theory of a modern superpower? In the spring of 1929, a local farmer digging a well in the Sichuan province of southwestern China struck something hard beneath the clay. He unearthed a large cache of beautifully carved jade items that hinted at an ancient presence in the area. Decades passed with only minor exploratory digs, while mainstream historians firmly focused their attention on the Yellow River Basin as the undisputed cradle of Asian civilization. It was not until 1986 that brickyard workers accidentally breached a massive subterranean vault, hidden beneath the soil. When official excavation teams finally arrived at the site known as Sanxingdui, they triggered a sequence of discoveries that completely shattered the established history of the continent. Researchers began unearthing a series of deep, rectangular trenches packed with monumental artifacts that looked absolutely nothing like the cultures they were taught to revere. They found themselves staring at hundreds of massive bronze faces deliberately stacked among layers of burnt animal bones and gold leaves. Picture the shock of pulling a bronze mask the size of a dining table out of the mud with angular features and massive protruding eyes. The aesthetic style of these items was entirely alien to the traditional relics found in the accepted centers of early civilization. Finding a highly advanced and totally distinct artistic culture flourishing in the remote Sichuan basin was a logistical nightmare for the academic establishment. The layout of the excavation revealed deeply unsettling anomalies regarding how these ancient people operated. The monumental bronzes were found intentionally broken and systematically burned before being carefully deposited into the pits alongside hundreds of elephant tusks. Despite the sheer volume of material wealth dumped into these trenches, the archaeologists found a complete lack of human remains or burial chambers. There was also absolutely no trace of any written language or localized script to explain who these people were or why they buried their greatest treasures. The entire civilization seemingly achieved a peak level of artistic mastery and then deliberately destroyed it all without leaving a single clue behind. Beyond the towering masks, the teams uncovered a massive bronze tree standing nearly 4 meters tall. The branches of this monumental cast were adorned with delicate bronze birds, dragons, and intricate geometric fruit. For reference, modern foundries utilizing computer-aided design and industrial machinery still find the sheer scale and thinness of these ancient casts highly difficult to replicate. The math simply doesn't add up when academics claim an isolated culture developed this level of precision metallurgy completely on their own without a long developmental history. Achieving such flawless geometric symmetry and massive bronze pores requires a deep understanding of thermal dynamics that experts insist did not exist during the 12th century BC. The chemical composition of the Sanxingdui bronzes presents another massive problem for mainstream historians. Metallurgical analysis revealed that the alloy contains a highly specific mixture of copper, tin, and lead that does not match any known local mines from that era. Picture the logistics of sourcing thousands of tons of rare heavy metals and transporting them across dense mountainous terrain without a recognized trade network. The lead isotopes found in the masks actually point to sources situated thousands of miles away, implying a vast and highly connected global supply chain. This physical evidence directly challenges the idea that these people were an isolated tribal settlement. The true threat of Sanxingdui lies in how its very existence disrupts a deeply ingrained national identity. Mainstream historians have spent generations building a curriculum based on a single unified bloodline expanding outward from the Yellow River. The physical reality of the bronze masks proves that the history of the region is actually a complex web of highly advanced and entirely independent empires. Acknowledging that an unknown and technologically superior civilization existed outside the accepted narrative forces the academic gatekeepers to rewrite their entire foundation. To protect the single origin theory of their civilization, the state apparatus stepped in to tightly manage the flow of information. They essentially quarantined the site to keep the broader implications under control. To keep the true history of the site hidden, authorities essentially locked down the entire area. Access is heavily monitored today, and excavation permits are incredibly difficult to secure. They actively break the research into isolated pieces, so no single independent team can connect the dots about the distant trade routes. The masks themselves are paraded around as cultural treasures, while the deep chemical data and strange soil dating are rarely shared with the outside world. Anyone who tries to link these artifacts to other global civilizations is quickly shut down and banned from the ruins. The narrative is carefully managed to make visitors stare in awe without asking any real questions. You can see the mechanics of this suppression by looking at the massive museum complex built directly over the excavation pits. The museum frames the civilization as an odd local anomaly rather than a major disruption to the human timeline. The academic establishment would rather stick to a flawed textbook than admit an unknown superpower once thrived in the mountains of Sichuan. They neutralized the threat of the discovery by locking it behind glass and stripping away its true context. It perfectly shows how modern institutions sanitize physical evidence to make it safe for public consumption. But if an entire state apparatus can restrict the study of physical anomalies in Asia, how did the scientific establishment handle similar historical disruptions in the Americas? During the massive westward expansion of the 1800s, settlers and railroad crews began reshaping North America on an unprecedented scale. As they pushed through the dense forests of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, they encountered a landscape already heavily modified by an unknown ancient culture. Thousands of massive earthen mounds rose out of the terrain, standing in stark contrast to the natural topography of the frontier. Progress demanded flat land for farming and new train tracks, so these ancient earthworks were routinely bulldozed without a second thought. It was during this systematic destruction of the American wilderness that workers began unearthing physical artifacts that completely defied the accepted map of human biology. The engineering of the mounds themselves presented a massive logistical problem for mainstream historians long before any bones were ever discovered. Many of these structures contained millions of cubic feet of soil, precisely aligned to complex lunar and solar cycles. Some were shaped like enormous animals, visible only from the sky, while others were perfect geometric pyramids, rivaling the footprint of ancient monuments in Egypt. Building these structures required a deep understanding of advanced geometry and a massive, highly organized labor force. The accepted historical narrative claimed this level of civilization did not exist in pre-Columbian North America, creating immediate friction between physical reality and academic theory. When digging into the centers of these sophisticated astronomical alignments, farmers and construction crews repeatedly made discoveries that triggered local panics. They began pulling skeletal remains from the earth that exhibited extraordinary height and entirely bizarre anatomical features. These physical artifacts were frequently documented as measuring 7 to 8 feet tall, with unusually thick skulls and massive jawbones. Many accounts specifically detailed anomalies, like double rows of teeth or unusual cranial capacities that did not match any known local indigenous populations. The disruption to the historical record became too large to ignore once the physical presence of the actual mound builders was brought into the light. These anomalous discoveries were not isolated campfire legends spread by word of mouth among superstitious settlers. They were formal, highly detailed reports printed in reputable daily newspapers scattered across the continent. You can read countless articles from the era where local town doctors or magistrates were brought in to physically examine and measure the bones firsthand. The sheer volume of these independent local discoveries creates a massive logic trap for anyone trying to defend the mainstream narrative today. We are looking at hundreds of separate communities across different states, all reporting the exact same specific anatomical anomalies over a period of several decades. Modern academics often try to dismiss every single one of these historical accounts as a localized hoax or a misidentified animal bone. The math simply doesn't add up when you consider the communication limitations of the 19th century. Coordinating a continent-wide conspiracy to plant fake giant skeletons and convince hundreds of independent doctors to lie about their medical findings makes no sense whatsoever. The localized newspaper reports reflect a genuine period of chaotic discovery before centralized institutions stepped in to take control of the narrative. The settlers were simply reporting exactly what they pulled out of the ground before they were told it was wrong to do so. As the volume of these disruptive reports grew, the newly formed federal government realized they needed to establish a definitive, unified history of the continent. The early Smithsonian institution tasked its Bureau of Ethnology to create a linear and uncomplicated model of human development in North America. Under the direction of figures like John Wesley Powell, the Bureau worked to solidify a narrative that matched the expansionist politics of the era. Acknowledging an unknown race of massive, highly advanced mound builders completely threatened that carefully curated anthropological map. To protect their established timeline and maintain academic authority, the institution took aggressive steps to control the physical evidence. Picture the logistics of federal agents arriving in rural farming towns specifically to take possession of these anomalous remains. The Smithsonian began dispatching field representatives across the Midwest to secure the excavation sites and pressure local historical societies to hand over their findings. The authorities convinced local magistrates that these unique artifacts required the advanced study and safekeeping that only a national museum could provide. Historical train manifests and local records show massive crates being loaded onto freight cars in towns across the country, all bound for the capital. The sheer volume of physical evidence boxed up and moved into federal custody during this period is staggering to consider. Once those train cars arrived in Washington, the skeletal remains simply dropped out of the public record entirely. The academic establishment made absolutely sure these anomalous bones never saw the inside of a public display case or a university laboratory. There were no official papers published about the extraordinary height of the mound builders, and no further biological studies were ever commissioned by the state. The physical evidence was actively compartmentalized and buried deep inside the museum's vast storage network to ensure it could not challenge the accepted textbooks. By physically removing the artifacts from the local communities that found them, the gatekeepers effectively sanitized the history of the entire continent. Modern researchers have spent years trying to track down the contents of those 19th century train cars to verify the newspaper accounts. Independent investigators routinely file Freedom of Information requests to access the specific accession logs from the early days of the Bureau of Ethnology. They cross-reference the old local articles with the dates shipments were sent to the capital to find out exactly where the bones are currently stored. Instead of academic transparency, they are met with a wall of institutional silence and heavy bureaucratic resistance. The museum routinely claims that the specific remains in question were either lost in early warehouse fires or simply never existed in the first place. When researchers do manage to bypass the bureaucracy and access the museum's internal records, they find highly suspicious gaps in the filing system. The Smithsonian openly admits to holding tens of thousands of Native American remains in their restricted storage facilities today. Yet when investigators look up the specific catalog numbers linked directly to the anomalous mound discoveries, those files are consistently marked as empty or misfiled. It takes a very deliberate effort to completely lose hundreds of massive skeletal remains that were officially documented and shipped via federal rail. The gatekeepers rely on the passage of time and the sheer size of their restricted archives to keep the true nature of the mound builders hidden. This entire situation leaves us looking at the most trusted museum archives on Earth and questioning the integrity of their foundation. When a modern institution actively obscures its own catalog to protect an outdated map of human development, the scientific process is fundamentally compromised. Surely these vanished skeletons couldn't all be a simple clerical error, right? Deep in the farming region of Transylvania, the small village of Tartaria looks completely unremarkable. But beneath the soil lies an ancient earth mound, holding one of archaeology's most controversial secrets. In the spring of 1961, a Romanian researcher named Nicolae Vlasa arrived at the site. His team was simply looking for basic pottery to help map out the area's early farming communities. As they dug down into the absolute lowest layers of the settlement, they unexpectedly broke through into a small, untouched burial pit. Tucked among ordinary stone tools and shell bracelets were 3 small clay tablets that immediately stood out from the dark dirt. 2 of the tablets were rectangular, and one was perfectly round with a distinct hole drilled straight through the top. The burial pit itself was strange and added a heavy layer of mystery to the dig. The remains belonged to a single person, who researchers eventually called the shaman due to the unusual arrangement of the grave. The bones were partially scorched and laid to rest alongside clay figurines and a massive seashell bracelet. This specific type of burial suggests the individual held a highly important religious or social role within their community. Placing the clay tablets in such a deliberate ritual setting implies the writings were considered sacred or deeply powerful. Whoever this person was, they were entrusted with items of immense cultural value before the pit was permanently sealed away. The surface of these clay pieces was covered in distinct pictorial symbols, divided by intersecting lines. They did not look like random artistic carvings or the simple decorative patterns usually found on ancient European pottery. The markings were highly organized and arranged in a way that clearly represented a complex system of communication. Some symbols looked like local animals and plants, while others were purely abstract geometric shapes. Vlasa realized almost immediately that he was looking at an early form of writing. The symbols looked remarkably like the earliest scripts found in the Middle East, but the deep soil layer of the burial suggested they were vastly older. When they were first pulled from the damp earth, the tablets were soft and incredibly fragile. To save the clay for future study, the excavation team carefully baked the artifacts in a laboratory oven to harden the material. Once the physical integrity of the items was secure, researchers used radiocarbon dating on the organic material found right next to them in the pit. The results sent shockwaves through the academic world by placing the burial squarely around 5,500 BC. This specific date created a massive problem for the established maps of human development. It meant these small clay artifacts from a Romanian village were over 1,000 years older than the Sumerian cuneiform. For generations, the mainstream narrative has rigidly defended Mesopotamia as the absolute birthplace of complex written language. We are taught that writing was a direct result of massive societies building the first true cities in the Middle East. Acknowledging the Tartaria Tablets meant tearing down a century of accepted history and completely rewriting the textbooks from scratch. The academic establishment was entirely unwilling to concede that European farmers developed a functional script long before those great empires even existed. Mainstream historians immediately launched a campaign to discredit the findings without ever bothering to visit the excavation site in person. Gatekeepers quickly argued that the radiocarbon dating was flawed, or that the artifacts must have been dropped into the pit by later civilizations. The most common excuse used to dismiss the tablets is the concept of an intrusive burial. They claim that someone from a much later era must have dug a deep hole into the older soil just to bury the items. This theory completely ignores the meticulous field notes taken by Vlasa. His records showed the sediment layers above the pit were totally undisturbed. You have a clear physical record proving the artifacts belong to the original 5,500 BC settlement. It makes no sense whatsoever to ignore hard physical data simply because it disrupts the preferred timeline. Critics also weaponize the conservation methods to invalidate the discovery entirely. Because the team baked the clay to preserve it, the tablets themselves could no longer be accurately tested using modern chemical dating methods. Mainstream academics seized on this detail to cast a massive shadow of doubt over the entire excavation. They used a standard preservation technique as an excuse to completely ignore the carbon dating of the human bones found directly beside the tablets. By focusing entirely on laboratory red tape, they avoided dealing with the timeline anomaly itself. The establishment essentially used a technicality to bury the physical evidence. The people who carved these tablets belonged to the broader Vinca culture spanning across the Balkans. Other excavations in the region have turned up thousands of similar geometric symbols carved into pottery and clay figures. Mainstream experts routinely classify these widespread markings as simple property marks or religious symbols to avoid calling it a true script. The establishment actively refuses to connect the dots between the distinct grammar of the Tartaria Tablets and the wider network of symbols found across southeastern Europe. They isolate the physical evidence to prevent anyone from seeing the massive scale of this early literate society. The reluctance to study the Vinca culture properly reveals a massive blind spot in modern archaeology. We are looking at a vast network of ancient settlements that shared a unified system of communication thousands of years before the first pharaohs. The sheer volume of artifacts bearing these specific symbols proves this was not just a localized artistic trend. Yet major universities continue to deny funding for large-scale comparative studies of the Balkan scripts. The gatekeepers rely on maintaining geographical boundaries in their research to prevent a cohesive picture of ancient Europe from emerging. It takes a deliberate institutional effort to look at thousands of matching symbols and declare them entirely meaningless. By casting enough doubt on the excavation methods, the establishment successfully sidelined the discovery. The Tartaria Tablets were quickly labeled as localized anomalies and heavily marginalized in major university curriculums. Western academia largely relegated these artifacts to the fringe rather than investigating the broader implications of a literate European prehistory. The artifacts remain housed in a Romanian museum, but they are almost never mentioned in global discussions about the origins of writing. High in the Andes Mountains, the city of Cuenca hides a very dark chapter of modern archaeology. Back in the 1920s, an Italian missionary named Father Carlo Crespi arrived to work with the local tribes of the Amazon. He spent decades earning their absolute trust by providing food, basic medicine, and education to the most remote jungle camps. In return for his kindness, the local people began bringing him ancient gifts. They pulled these items from a vast network of hidden underground cave systems. Over the years, these offerings grew from small clay figures into a massive hoard of priceless metal artifacts. Crespi housed these items right in the courtyard of his local parish, creating a sprawling, open-air museum of forgotten history. Picture walking into a dusty church courtyard and finding it completely overflowing with thousands of massive golden plates. Instead of primitive trinkets, researchers found heavily engineered sheets of precious metal standing several feet tall and weighing dozens of pounds. The sheer volume of the gold, silver, and complex metal blends gathered in this one location was entirely staggering. Many of the plates featured highly advanced metalwork, including precision stamping and intricate carvings that completely defied the technological timeline of the region. The indigenous tribes consistently maintained that they did not craft these items themselves. They simply recovered them from deep underground chambers, left behind by a much older culture. Finding a hoard of this magnitude in a modest Ecuadorian church immediately drew international attention. The most disruptive part of the collection was not the sheer wealth of the metals, but the specific symbols etched into their surfaces. Hundreds of the golden plates were covered in unknown writing that looked entirely Middle Eastern or Sumerian in origin. Researchers who visited the courtyard documented distinct carvings of winged griffins, stepped pyramids, and serpents that closely mirrored the artwork of ancient Babylon. The text adorning these artifacts did not match any known ancient language from the Americas. It suggested a highly developed system of communication, combining phonetic symbols and complex geometric patterns. Recognizing ancient Mesopotamian text on golden plates in South America directly challenged everything academia claimed to know about early human travel. A common jungle tribe simply could not forge the complex language of the ancient Mediterranean. The existence of the Crespi collection creates a massive problem for the rigid timelines of mainstream history. We are taught that the Atlantic Ocean acted as an impenetrable wall, keeping the ancient cultures of the Middle East completely isolated from the Americas. Acknowledging physical evidence of Sumerian script in Ecuador suggests a highly connected global civilization operating thousands of years before Christopher Columbus. Father Crespi firmly believed the artifacts prove that early Mediterranean cultures crossed the oceans and settled in the Amazon basin. To protect the established maps of human development, the academic establishment had to find a way to neutralize the threat this sprawling courtyard posed to their textbooks. The easiest way to handle physical evidence of an unknown global culture is to erase the collection entirely. The systematic removal of the artifacts began in 1962, following a highly suspicious fire that severely damaged the church. While the exact cause of the blaze remains heavily disputed, the aftermath provided the perfect opportunity to dismantle the museum. In the chaos following the disaster, a massive portion of the most controversial golden plates simply vanished from the property. Witness accounts suggest that representatives from religious institutions arrived quickly, specifically to secure the most valuable and historically disruptive pieces. These artifacts were reportedly boxed up and shipped overseas, disappearing directly into the private restricted vaults of the Vatican. It makes very little sense for a religious institution to confiscate physical evidence of an unknown civilization, unless that evidence directly threatens their established authority over the historical narrative. The items that actually survived the fire and the initial sweep were not left in the hands of the local community. Following the death of Father Crespi in 1982, the Central Bank of Ecuador quietly stepped in to purchase the remaining pieces of the collection. You would naturally expect a national bank to prominently display these priceless cultural treasures in a major public museum. Instead, the institution locked the artifacts away in their own private storage facilities, effectively removing them from public view permanently. Independent researchers and linguists who request access to study the remaining golden plates are routinely denied entry or met with heavy bureaucratic resistance. By actively blocking access to the physical materials, the authorities ensure the true origins of the artifacts remain safely hidden from any modern scientific testing. The entire sequence of events surrounding the Father Crespi collection reveals a highly coordinated effort to sanitize human history. We are looking at a deliberate institutional strategy to confiscate, hide, and suppress physical artifacts that contradict the accepted global narrative. It is highly concerning that major modern institutions actively choose to lock away paradigm-shifting discoveries rather than rewrite an outdated curriculum to reflect physical reality. Picture the dark, restricted archives stretching beneath Rome, where the true history of our world is quietly decided and contained. If the definitive proof of a connected ancient world is sitting in a private vault right now, what other chapters of the human story have they already erased? Out in the dry scrubland of New Mexico sits a flat mesa known locally as Mystery Mountain. To reach the top, you have to hike up a steep, rocky ravine that offers zero shelter from the desert sun. Hidden near the peak of this rugged trail sits a massive basalt boulder weighing roughly 80 tons. Carved directly into the flat face of this volcanic rock is a dense block of text that looks totally out of place in the American Southwest. Archaeologist Frank Hibben officially documented the site in 1933 after a local guide claimed he had seen the stone as a young boy in the 1880s. Finding a massive inscribed monument hidden in the middle of nowhere immediately makes you wonder who was actually crossing these deserts long before European settlers arrived. The carving is not just a collection of random scratches or local indigenous rock art. It is a highly structured version of the Ten Commandments, written in a variation of ancient Paleo-Hebrew. What makes this so strange is the specific grammar used by the unknown author. The text features a complex blend of ancient Hebrew mixed with distinct Greek influences that points to a very specific time frame around the 1st century. A common railway worker or 19th century pioneer simply would not have the deep academic knowledge required to forge such an obscure ancient dialect. Carving this much text into solid rock takes immense effort and a profound dedication to the message. Volcanic basalt is incredibly hard and notoriously difficult to cut. To make a single precise groove in this material requires specialized steel tools and a tremendous amount of physical force. Picture the nightmare of a supposed 19th century prankster, hauling heavy industrial equipment up a treacherous desert incline just to play a practical joke. The cuts on the Los Lunas stone are deep and deliberate, showing none of the erratic slipping you see from someone casually scratching at a rock. The person who created this monument was a highly skilled stonemason executing a perfectly planned document. This was a permanent physical marker, claiming a presence in an unknown land. The very existence of this stone creates a massive logistical nightmare for mainstream historians. The accepted map of human development firmly states that there was zero contact between the Middle East and the Americas before Christopher Columbus. Acknowledging a Paleo-Hebrew monument in the desert completely shatters the barrier of the Atlantic Ocean. It implies a vast and connected global world where ancient mariners crossed the seas and explored deep into North America. To protect the standard curriculum, the academic gatekeepers had to neutralize the threat this 80-ton boulder posed to their textbooks. The easiest way to handle physical evidence you cannot explain is to simply refuse to acknowledge its legitimacy. Instead of treating the site as a groundbreaking archaeological find, Orthodox historians immediately labeled the entire thing an elaborate modern fake. They publicly claimed the stone was carved by a bored university student or early religious settlers trying to manufacture history for their beliefs. This theory completely ignores the physical reality of the site and the extreme isolation of the boulder itself. It makes zero logical sense for someone to forge a perfectly translated ancient text in a place where nobody would ever see it. The perpetrator would have to hike up a ravine and spend weeks hammering away at solid basalt just to walk away without ever claiming credit. The hoax explanation is just a convenient academic shield designed to prevent anyone from asking serious questions about ancient maritime travel. The most glaring issue with the academic response is their total refusal to apply basic science to the stone. Modern geologists could easily analyze the mineral patina inside the carved grooves to determine exactly how long the letters have been exposed to the wind. You would expect major universities to rush out and perform these standard weathering tests to definitively prove the hoax theory once and for all. Instead, mainstream archaeological institutions actively refuse to fund any official testing and heavily discourage independent researchers from bringing modern equipment to the mesa. By avoiding real testing entirely, the establishment protects themselves from data that might contradict their perfectly curated version of history. It is highly suspicious that experts refuse to apply the scientific method to a site that completely contradicts the experts' maps of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. By officially dismissing the monument without proper testing, the academic establishment effectively stripped the site of any federal protection. Because the boulder is categorized as a modern fake, rather than a legitimate historical artifact, it is left completely exposed to the elements and the general public. Vandals have repeatedly defaced the stone over the decades by scratching out entire lines of the ancient text and scrubbing the rock face with harsh chemicals. The gatekeepers know that leaving the stone unprotected in the desert is the most efficient way to erase the evidence permanently. They are allowing natural erosion and localized vandalism to solve a massive historical problem on their behalf. The physical destruction of the text guarantees that future scholars will never be able to run accurate chemical dating tests. This deliberate neglect shows exactly how modern institutions handle physical evidence that challenges the single origin theory of the Americas. We are looking at an organized strategy of institutional apathy designed to let a massive historical anomaly slowly weather away into dust. The profound implications of a connected ancient world are simply too dangerous for the mainstream narrative to accommodate without entirely collapsing. If we accept even a fraction of the transoceanic theory, the entire foundation of Western history needs to be completely rewritten from scratch. The gatekeepers are well aware that protecting the Los Lunas stone would validate a past they have spent centuries trying to deny. But if stone monuments in the desert are left unprotected to preserve the accepted timeline, how far back does the effort to suppress alternative human history actually go? In the late 1860s, a humble shipwright named Cornelis over de Linden walked into a small provincial library in the Netherlands. He was carrying a very strange family heirloom. He presented the head librarians with a heavily weathered stack of cotton paper, bound together and covered entirely in an unknown geometric script. According to his detailed family records, this specific manuscript had been passed down through their lineage for countless generations, with strict instructions to keep it hidden from the Catholic Church. The local academics were completely baffled by the physical text because the characters looked alien to any recognized European language. The ink was faded, and the pages showed clear signs of extreme age that immediately caught their attention. Finding a massive, untranslated document tucked away safely in a private Dutch estate sparked an immediate and frantic effort to decode its guarded secrets. A prominent local historian named Dr. Jan Gerhardus Ottema eventually took on the monumental task of translating the manuscript in the 1870s. He He had a deep background in ancient texts and quickly discovered that the book was written in a deeply archaic form of Old Frisian. The original authors used a highly unique phonetic alphabet, where the letters were based entirely on the geometric lines of a six-spoked wheel. This symbol was known to the writers as the fundamental shape of the universe, and it heavily influenced their entire culture. This mathematical approach to writing created a structured and complex language system that predated modern European alphabets by thousands of years. Translating the document revealed a historical narrative so vast and detailed that it completely threatened the established understanding of Western civilization. The translated text became known to the world as the Oera book, and it detailed the history of a highly advanced society flourishing along the coastlines of ancient Europe. The manuscript describes a vast matriarchal civilization governed by a strict code of civic ethics and led by a lineage of powerful priestesses known as the Folk Mothers. The most disruptive section of the book chronicles the catastrophic destruction of a massive landmass called Atland, located in the North Sea. According to the specific dates provided in the text, this continent-sized island sank into the ocean following a series of violent tectonic upheavals around 2194 BC. The writers meticulously recorded the environmental fallout of this global disaster, including massive tidal waves, sudden climate shifts, and years of heavily darkened skies. Beyond the terrifying destruction of Atland, the book serves as a detailed historical ledger for the Frisian people across thousands of years of human history. It outlines their massive maritime expansion and their complex political interactions with other ancient cultures across the European continent. The text claims these ancient mariners established highly organized maritime trade routes and heavily influenced the political development of early Celtic and Nordic societies long before recorded history. We are taught by modern university textbooks that early Europeans were mostly disorganized tribal groups, struggling to survive the harsh northern winters. The Oera book presents a physical record of a sophisticated seafaring empire, operating effectively thousands of years before the rise of Greece or Rome. When Ottema finally published his Dutch translation, the mainstream academic establishment went into an immediate and highly predictable panic. Acknowledging the manuscript meant admitting that a highly advanced, literate society existed in Northern Europe, long before the accepted cradle of civilization in the Middle East. The text completely ruined the established timeline of human development and threatened the entire geographical curriculum of 19th century universities. To neutralize the massive threat this document posed, the academic gatekeepers quickly launched a coordinated campaign to brand the entire text as an elaborate modern fake. They publicly ridiculed the book in national papers and systematically destroyed the academic reputation of anyone who attempted to study the history seriously. The establishment officially pinned the blame for the supposed hoax on Cornelis over de Linden himself, hoping to quickly close the terrifying case. They confidently claimed the humble shipwright authored the complex manuscript in his spare time, just to artificially inflate the historical importance of his own family. The logic of this accusation simply doesn't hold up under basic scrutiny, especially when you examine the actual linguistic contents of the book. To successfully forge the Oera book, a 19th century shipyard worker would need a masterful understanding of ancient languages and deeply obscure European history. He would have had to invent an entirely new phonetic alphabet that remained completely internally consistent across hundreds of pages of perfectly structured Frisian grammar. The manuscript also contains highly specific geological and meteorological data that was completely unknown to mainstream 19th century science. The ancient text accurately describes the precise mechanics of tectonic plate shifts and the resulting climatic changes following major global volcanic events. A working-class shipwright in the 1860s simply did not have access to the kind of advanced environmental data required to fake these detailed planetary descriptions. The writers of the text were clearly recording real catastrophic events that they experienced and witnessed firsthand over multiple generations. Orthodox historians completely ignored this specific scientific data, because addressing it would mean acknowledging the terrifying authenticity of the ancient physical record. Rather than conducting a proper scientific investigation into the paper and ink, the academic community simply bullied the manuscript out of the public eye. The establishment actively ridiculed the text in major academic journals, until it became absolute career suicide for any respectable historian to associate with the material. The original document was eventually locked away securely in provincial archives to ensure it could not cause any further disruption to the carefully curated historical narrative. By completely restricting public access to the physical pages, the gatekeepers effectively stopped any independent linguistic analysis dead in its tracks. The manuscript was buried under a mountain of heavy academic stigma without ever receiving a fair and objective scientific trial. The original physical manuscript remains securely locked in the restricted archives of the Tresor Library in Leeuwarden to this very day. The institution remains highly reluctant to allow independent researchers to conduct modern chemical dating tests on either the ancient paper or the specialized ink. The academic establishment relies heavily on an outdated 19th century verdict to justify keeping the document away from modern scientific scrutiny. The absolute refusal to properly date the material shows a clear institutional preference for maintaining a flawed textbook over discovering the truth about our past. Now it's your turn. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more videos every single week. And as always, until next time, stay curious.